Well, we are right at noon, so we'll go ahead and get started to be mindful of people's time. Welcome today to Housing First Friday, and today's session is about the community impacts of homelessness. And so we're going to talk today about how homelessness affects everybody. And in the chat, you'll see I put a link to the handout if you'd like to download that. My name is Liesl Manone, and I am the Communications and Fund Development Director for the DRC. And with us today is Mr. Bruce Frankel, and he is our Executive Director. And so I am going to go ahead and turn it over to Bruce. Well, give me just a second though. We are going to have some time for some questions. And so if you have questions, go ahead and type those into the chat box. And I will make sure that Bruce answers them. So go ahead, Bruce, and take it away. And I'm going to stop my own video.
Okay, thank you, Liesl. I hope everybody can hear me, and I hope everybody's doing well today. Thank you so much for joining us. As Liesl said, I'm Bruce Frankel, and I'm the Executive Director of DRC Solutions. And I've been here at this agency 15 years. I think I have a fairly good perspective on homelessness in Fort Worth and Tarrant County. And prior, I started my career working homeless services in San Francisco in 1976. I always use San Francisco as kind of a cautionary tale for what could happen here in Fort Worth and Tarrant County over the next decade or two as we become a larger and larger city. Fort Worth was just announced as the 12th largest city in America with almost 1 million people. And we're starting to experience big city issues. And one of those issues is the impact that homelessness has on a growing community like ours. So this is one of 6 presentations that we make through the year called Housing First Fridays. And today we're going to talk about the community impact on homelessness. In prior presentations, we've really focused in on what homelessness is and how it impacts the individuals who may temporarily be experiencing loss of housing. But today we're going to talk in a little bit broader terms on how the phenomenon of homelessness impacts our community. And it does so in a lot of ways. And it's, you know, as we go around and talk to people in our community through neighborhood associations and a lot of the work that Liesl does in communicating to our stakeholders, you know, we ask people, you know, how homelessness impacts them personally, how it impacts their neighborhood, how they feel it impacts the perception of our community. And those are the things that we're going to talk about today. So there are a number of different impacts that homelessness have outside the direct and very devastating impact it has on the individual experiencing loss of housing. Everybody has experienced people that are homeless in our community. If you drive around, particularly if you drive down East Lancaster, you'll see people that are sleeping in tents, that are sleeping on the sidewalk, that are sleeping under bridges. You'll see people perhaps in your neighborhood walking around that look very disheveled. They may be experiencing mental health issues. You may also experience trash that is left behind, not just by folks that don't have permanent housing and have to drag everything that they own with them, but by well-meaning citizens who will stop on the side of the road and unload a black plastic bag full of clothing in the interest of being sure that people that are homeless have clothing, or they might drop off food or water. And oftentimes we see the collective mess of this on our streets. So, you know, I want to start with the social impacts of homelessness, and then we'll get more into the financial impact of homelessness. But everybody, as I said, that I've talked to, and I imagine you as well, have stories of seeing people that are homeless or seeing the impact of or the footprint of people trying to find some place to shelter when they don't have their own place to shelter, and they may not have space for them, or they may not choose to go into a nighttime shelter. So at any one point in our, in any one day in Fort Worth, there's probably about 2,300 people that are homeless, and only half of those folks are actually in some sort of emergency or temporary shelter. The rest of those folks are on the streets, living in encampments throughout our community in the different neighborhoods. And everybody is experiencing the social impacts of homelessness. So what are those impacts? They're varied. I want to talk a little bit about the emotional and psychological impact that seeing homeless people that are homeless and trancing on the streets has on us. When we see people out in public who look disheveled, who might be mentally ill and are talking loudly to themselves or angry and ranting and raving to no one in particular, it's alarming. It impacts our sense of safety. It impacts our sense of security, and it impacts our sense of control. So when we see people that are unsheltered, that are wandering around our streets, camping under the bridges and things like that, it evokes fear in us, concern, it evokes suspicion, and oftentimes it evokes anger as well. All across America, particularly, in the shadow of the past year we had with COVID, there are more unsheltered people than we've seen before. And it's a much more public and broader topic of discussion on how the average citizen is seeing homelessness in their neighborhood and how alarming that is for folks. So that can't be understated, the emotional and psychological impact seeing disenfranchised people on the streets who are at the very tail end of poverty, suffering, perhaps engaging in behaviors that more private behaviors that are seen in public. It is alarming, and it sets the stage for our own personal politics or philosophy around homelessness. So if we're fearful, we're likely to have a negative, probably it's negatively going to color our perspective on those folks that are experiencing homelessness. And it serves to create a negative bias on who these people are. It tends to create a perception that once you're homeless, you're always homeless or stuck with that label, or that you're dangerous and that it's something to fear. This makes us angry. This makes us want to call our elected officials and complain. And that has a big impact on how the city responds from a policy point of view in addressing homelessness. Sometimes it takes a burr in the saddle to bring everybody's attention and focus on an issue that needs to be addressed. And people that have lost their housing, are unsheltered, and are living as transients in our community is an issue that needs attention. So for those people that are experiencing homelessness, and I do want to emphasize that it's hard not to point to someone who's experiencing homelessness and say, oh, there's someone that's homeless, or there's a homeless person. I do want to emphasize that homelessness is a temporary condition. And really in our field, what we mean when we say homelessness, we're referring to people that have lost their housing and are living in places that are considered uninhabitable or living in constructed and supervised emergency shelters. Uh, it by no means is a label that is meant to stay with someone, because once someone's housed, they're no longer homeless. They're merely just experiencing extreme poverty. So a lot of times when we refer to homelessness, we're talking about folks that are experiencing homelessness or experiencing poverty or an imbalance in their life where they don't have the resources to provide for themselves, nor does their family, adequate housing and other supports. So anyway, people that are experiencing homelessness they find themselves without social supports, and they live really on the edge of society. Um, and this leads not only to us observing this phenomenon having negative connotations, but for the folks that are experiencing homelessness, it puts them at higher rate of victimization. Uh, Poor health, loneliness, depression, and all of these things lead to chemical dependency, crime, and a host of other issues. So we find that a lot of the crime that we might experience in neighborhoods can be directly or indirectly related to our inability to get a proper handle on people that have been disenfranchised and are without any type of support, particularly for those folks that might be hungry, that might have a health condition that requires some medication, or people that might have pre-existing conditions like serious mental illness or drug and alcohol addiction. As you can imagine, if these folks don't have any types of supports and they do not have regular shelter, people are going to do what they can do to get their needs met. Sometimes that leads to petty crime. If people are looking for sources of money, sometimes that leads to theft. And all these things do impact our community. We also find that people that are without shelter, their life expectancy is much lower than yours and mine. So in the United States right now, average life expectancy for a man is 78 years. For a person without a home, it's 50 years. So there's almost 30 years reduced life expectancy for folks that are homeless. That has a big impact on our community, not only in the cost of treating folks that become chronically ill and are facing end of life. For folks that don't have regular home, live in a regular neighborhood and regular resources, oftentimes when they get sick or ill, their only recourse is to call an ambulance and have most of their health care, including primary health care, taken care of through our emergency rooms. So homelessness becomes very costly, has a very significant cost impact in our community. And the direct and indirect costs to our major healthcare systems, also our ambulance systems, fire and police as well. When people when there's a 911 call, an ambulance, fire truck, and a police unit are scrambled to go to that incident. So with lots of people that may be on the streets and not have adequate shelter, we find that their healthcare costs are extremely high because all of those costs are being met through the emergency room. That has a big impact on our community, how resources are spent and used and allocated. And when I talk about the cost, I'm talking about millions and millions and millions of dollars every year. So there are a lot of social impacts of homelessness, not just isolation from community, not just in terms of the fear it might evoke in regular citizens and concern, but the low life expectancy. All of this rolls up into significant costs. So let's talk a little bit about those financial impacts. So there are tangible costs to us as taxpayers related to homelessness. So for those of you that have driven down East Lancaster or have perused the websites of the DRC or some of the other large homeless service providers like Tarrant County Homeless Coalition, Presbyterian Night Shelter, Salvation Army Union Gospel Mission, and you look at all the programs and all the staff, and if you drive down here, you see all of the buildings that are dedicated and used to provide services. There's a lot of money that goes into homelessness. Every year we're looking at somewhere between 30 to upwards of $40 million a year spent in Fort Worth and Tarrant County to address our issues of homelessness. In addition to the cost of providing services, and that covers things like case management, emergency nighttime shelter, the cost of housing people either temporarily through rapid rehousing programs or more permanently through permanent supported housing programs. It costs a lot of money, and we pay for that as taxpayers. So the community impact hits us in the pocketbook. So I think as citizens, it's really important to ask ourselves, what's the best use of those dollars? And looking forward into the future, do we want to continue to spend dollars the way we have in the past? Or are there more efficient ways of spending dollars to get the same outcome? Those are important questions because over the years, there's been a significant infrastructure of services that have been built in our community that include lots of buildings, agencies that have been around for upwards of 120 years in our community, basically doing what we're doing today. And I think as citizens, we seem to feel, well, next year, maybe we'll do the same as we did last year, but do more of it. We have to, one of the purposes of these First Fridays is to create more awareness and more insight to get our citizens and people that are interested in this issue to think a little deeper. So there are a lot of people that are thinking of how is the best way to spend our dollars in getting people off the streets and reducing the number of folks that are experiencing homelessness and the impact of that on our community. So I'd like you to think for a while after you've finished our hour together, think of the different ways that we might as a community spend dollars to get the same outcome. And I want to give you an example. So right now we spend anywhere from $30 to $40 million providing, hiring agencies that then build buildings and hire staff to provide case management, to provide health care, to provide behavioral health care services, and to provide housing options for folks. And those costs need to be sustained every year, particularly as we place people in housing that's subsidized. And then as we look to the future of Fort Worth growing, those numbers are going to get bigger. So, some communities are experimenting with guaranteed annual income. So we find that it costs about anywhere from $8,000 to $12,000 a year per person. And if we were to give people money, would just, guaranteed income every year, would it lead to less people falling into homelessness? Would we get the same incomes or the same outcomes by having people make their own decisions rather than decisions guided by case managers? These are some provocative questions that we're looking at, particularly now that we're recouping from a year of isolation, as we're re-examining on many different levels, personal and professional, what we want to do as we move forward. One question to ask is, given the impacts, particularly the financial impacts of our current solutions to addressing homelessness, are there solutions where we get just as good of outcome or better outcome for less dollar? I think that's going to be an important question. And I think Governments are always asking that type of question. How can we create a better community, and how can we do so financially efficiently? So probably the big financial impacts in our community related to homelessness are, one, as I've just discussed, the cost, the amount of money we have to put into addressing homelessness, and then the cost to our healthcare system, the cost to law enforcement. Every time there is an issue related to street homelessness, police may be called if someone is acting out on the streets, if someone is appearing to trespass or appears to be a vagrant. Those are police calls. Every time someone gets sick or injured on the street, an ambulance is called, a police unit is called, and a fire truck. Those are all expenses to our community. Also, in addition to these costs, there's the cost of code enforcement to clean up multiple encampments where people camp. And it's an ongoing process because you clean up one encampment. It's expensive when code comes in to have to clear stuff away. And then 2 or 3 weeks later, the camp might be back. Those people have to go somewhere to shelter if we as a community can't shelter them. And then there are, the costs that you wouldn't even think of. So, for example, a lot of money is spent in our public libraries to provide programs and services for people that may come in that are homeless. This public library is one of the last remaining large public access buildings that everybody has a First Amendment right to access. So our libraries devote resources as well to addressing homelessness. So there's another financial impact of homelessness, community impact, is upon our businesses in our community. So Fort Worth is a very business-oriented community. We are a growing community. With the last census count, we jumped from the 16th largest city in America to the 12th. And Dallas-Fort Worth is one of the fastest growing metropolitan areas in the country. And one of the big objectives of our city government and our Chamber of Commerce is to attract business to Fort Worth. And the more businesses that are attracted to an urban area, the more tax revenues are generated to create the quality of life that we want to see in Fort Worth. So, there are regions in our country where unsheltered homelessness has almost gotten to the point of being out of control. And I'm thinking of places like San Francisco, LA in particular. And what we find that businesses now are making quality of life decisions on where they locate their headquarters or where they locate production plants. And employees are having more say on what they need and what they want in terms of moving to different communities at the behest of their business to move to communities where there is a good quality of life. And right now, we have a really good quality of life here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And some people are moving here and some companies are relocating because of the chaos that they're experiencing, in part because of large numbers of unsheltered homeless men and women, particularly in cities like LA, where there's a neighborhood of 35,000 unsheltered homeless men and women. It has a big impact on business. So in the future, as we look to how our community here grows over the next 20, 30, and 40 years, now's the time to be thinking about the impact that unaddressed issues of homelessness may have on a growing community. Now is a good time to address the issues of how to house more people, how to have more programs that draw people inside and off the streets. So while it's relatively inexpensive to do so, rather than try to address these issues 40 years from now when Fort Worth might be the 6th or 7th largest city in the country, and we've run out of space to build new housing. So businesses do consider what goes on with homelessness. Agencies like the DRC have had very close relationships with not just the city of Fort Worth, but with our local Chamber of Commerce and with an agency called Downtown Fort Worth, Inc., which is like a private chamber of commerce that represents the large business and property owners' interest in downtown Fort Worth. And of course, as people go into downtown Fort Worth, these business interests want to be sure that people have a good experience, because they go home and they tell their friends or they tell their businesses Fort Worth appears to be clean, safe, and accessible by foot, and people will start to book more conventions in Fort Worth. And in fact, Fort Worth is and has been making significant investment in hotel and event venues to attract more conventions and more visitors to Fort Worth, because that's part of our economic plan to pay for the things that we like, is to have these events and have people come into our community and spend dollars. And strategies to address homelessness are part of that formula for how we create a downtown and a community and a business environment that does attract people. So homelessness, we want to talk a little bit about the impact of solutions to homelessness. And I do want to dispel some misconceptions people probably have. So the cost of simply managing homelessness, like the cost of what the DRC does, what the shelters do, as I said, it's estimated between $30 and $40 million. When we place people in housing, it actually sounds like, well, that sounds like it's going to be very expensive to pay to put people in housing and to pay their subsidies for their housing, literally forever. But some pretty significant studies have been done over the last 10 or 15 years, and here's what they found. In general, the cost of doing what we do now, case management, outreach services, emergency shelter, that costs about, let's see, what is the exact cost of that? Cost about $48 a day per person. If you look at all the costs that go into homelessness and you divide that by the number of people that are in shelter. For someone that's experiencing homelessness and they're picked up for vagrancy and put in jail, the cost to our community for that is $70 a day. Okay. The cost for us to take someone off the streets, put them in subsidized housing, is approximately $25 a day. So what we find is a solution and an insight into the economic impact of homelessness and what's the best course. So merely to do what we do to arrest people, to place people in emergency shelters, is the most expensive response to homelessness. And who pays for that? We do, as the taxpayer. The least expensive option is to place people into housing. And that's what the DRC does. That's our focus. But it's not just our focus. It's now the focus of all the major homeless service providers in Tarrant County. Tarrant County Homeless Coalition, and all three of our major nighttime shelters all have really large programs to work and quickly get people into housing. Because what we found is it has the lowest economic impact with the biggest outcome for our community. So one of the other property impacts that homelessness has is the perception that to build housing just for lower income people, and that includes homeless folks, is going to reduce property values in our community. That if we make significant investments in housing for poor people, subsidized housing, scatter that all over our community, it's going to have a negative impact on property values. And in fact, that's one of the major arguments about this phenomenon called NIMBY. And that's where people say, yeah, there's a good solution, a good economic and a good humane solution to addressing homelessness, and that's putting people in housing. But if you don't mind, let's do it in someone else's neighborhood. Because I understand, what I hear as a citizen is that if you build, 48 units of permanent supported housing in my neighborhood, my property values are going to drop. So I have a heart for the homeless, but not in my neighborhood. That's basically, in a nutshell, the argument for NIMBYism, not in my backyard. Well, there have been some pretty significant studies done on the impact that supported and supervised housing has in neighborhoods. And, in general, what we're finding is that property values within 500 feet of a supported housing project tend to increase. Okay. We find that the big impact on property values has nothing to do with who's living in the property. It has to do with what's going on in the broader community. So in Fort Worth, property values are going up regardless of who's living next door to you, regardless of how many single family units are in your neighborhood, how many multiple family units. Property values are going up because Fort Worth is an attractive place to come work, because across the country we're seeing a demand for housing that exceeds the availability of housing. And that tends to drive up property values. It has nothing to do with whether or not there's a permanent supported, there are people that are permanent supported housing that are living in your neighborhood or my neighborhood. And in fact, once people do move into housing, they're no longer homeless. They are oftentimes working with case managers or getting into primary health care or behavioral health care. And we find that people that we move from extreme poverty into supported housing probably are receiving more attention to their health care, their social needs that you might find with any of the other neighborhoods or any of your other neighbors. I also found that houses a bit further away, between 50 and 1,000 feet from supported housing, property values initially dropped during construction, but then rose after completion. Because once people have that type of housing in their neighborhood, while people might be concerned and upset at first, oftentimes that concern and display of being upset causes other people to be fearful, and that's what might temporarily drive down housing costs. But once the fervor sort of settles, people move in, housing values rebound and rise to be competitive with any other housing values in the community. That's really important to know. One of the big barriers that we face as we're building new units of accessible, affordable housing and placing people in is the fear that folks that move in will be less desirable neighbors, and that there'll be more crime, and that your housing values and your quality of life will drop. But the research has shown that's just not the case. And it's important, and I thank you for participating in this type of discussion, because it really causes us all to ask questions about the things that we fear most when it comes to homelessness and the impact that it has on our community. So Let me see what time it's at. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit more, and I'm going to do some questions and answers, and we can talk more after that. People often ask me, and they ask my colleagues, and what can we do as citizens to get involved and have a voice with how our community addresses homelessness? And it's important that we all do have a voice, because as we've talked, the impacts of homelessness affect us all, either a little bit in the pocketbook, they impact our perspective on whether our community is a safe and secure and attractive community. It's a button that gets pushed that causes us at times to be fearful and suspicious of our neighbors. Those are significant impacts. So what can we do? So we can do a couple of things. One is certainly participating in discussions like this to take a deeper dive into the impacts of homelessness, not just on the people experiencing homelessness, but what it means for our community in terms of growth and business. What it means in our community related to policies, housing policies, and where houses and homes are built. And Fort Worth tends to be primarily a single-family zoning urban area. And it also impacts our sense of safety and well-being. So being able to get involved in these discussions is important. A next step is really being able to advocate for the solutions to homelessness. And as I've discussed a little bit today, and we will touch on in just about every presentation that we make this year, is the obvious solution to ending the conditions of homelessness and the impact that unsheltered homelessness has on our community is to continue to build enough affordable housing units so that we can place people that are homeless, currently homeless now, into housing. That's the solution. So when we talk about homelessness, how do we address that? Make someone no longer homeless. And we have the resources and the means to do so. We can do more in the future as we get more people involved in the dialogue around what's the best way to spend our money. Do we spend it in maintaining homelessness as we see it now? Or do we try to be a little more bold and make investments into more and building more units and subsidizing people's housing, placing them into housing at a cost that turns out to be less than maintaining what we're currently doing today. So those are areas that you can advocate, but you have to be well informed. The second thing is investing in the solution. So how can you invest? This isn't a fundraising pitch, so I'm not going to ask you for money. I'm talking more about investing your time and effort. If you do feel charitable, is to be thoughtful about how you're spending your dollars. Are you just giving dollars because you've always given dollars in a particular way? Or are you carefully looking at what different agencies are doing and maybe asking them before you give money, get a better idea of how they're spending those dollars? And if you are going to give money, ask if you can have a voice in how they make decisions around spending dollars. Donating $25, $30 a year is going to help us all. But if you're in that position where you can donate a very large gift to an organization, you're going to want to insist that you have some sort of a voice or a say in how those dollars get spent, and then be selective in giving your charitable dollars to agencies that are doing things that you feel are starting, helping to lessen the negative impact of homelessness in our community in a very cost-effective way. So I'm going to stop talking for a little bit. I know that there's some questions in the chat area. And Lisa, I'm going to ask if you can moderate some of that. See if there are any questions. Share those, and we'll talk around some of those.
Sure. So one of the things that I'd like for you to address a little bit is some of the changes that are coming down at the state level. So we have an end coming to the extra unemployment benefits that people have been receiving during the pandemic. And we also have some statewide laws concerning camping that are coming down. And
Right.
there's, how do you see these things affecting how we move forward in the future in helping to move people out of homelessness? Are people going to be, are we going to see an increase in homelessness? I know that we've seen somewhat of an increase during the pandemic time anyway. So can you talk to that a little bit?
I can. And again, I'm looking down in the chat. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them in there and we'll immediately get to them. Also, both Liesl and I are available offline at any time if you want to give us a call or send us an email, or if you have questions after you've, sort of pondered what we're talking about today. I hope this is just the beginning of our dialogue, so don't hesitate to reach out at some other time. So, one of the big things that my colleagues and I know people all over the country are talking about is, what are our communities going to look like as we recover from COVID? It's been a big economic hit that we've all taken around the initial shelter in place, closing of businesses. A lot of people lost their jobs, over the last 14 months. And a lot of the jobs that were lost were service jobs in restaurants, in bars, and entertainment venues. These tend to be lower paying jobs and have had a more severe impact on folks. So with COVID relief dollars, there have been three waves of COVID relief dollars that cities and municipalities have been able to access. And the average citizen, a lot of that has been used to help subsidize unemployment benefits while people have been out of work, to help pay for rent or mortgages, to help offset the cost of that when you're not working. And then also there have been some moratoriums on evictions for those folks that haven't been able to pay. At some point, though, the relief dollars will expire, and with that, so will the moratoriums on evictions. We don't know whether there's going to be this huge wave of people that haven't been able to pay their rent over the last 6 to 14 months, and now that rent comes due. For those people that didn't get 100% rent relief, but they did get relief from eviction, but the money still has to be paid to the landlord, who has to pay some sort of a bank note. It's kind of the big, the picture of the big fish and the little fish, sort of eating one another. It's a whole chain of financial impact. At some point, eviction moratoriums will expire. We anticipate there's going to be an increase certainly in short-term homelessness, as people being homeless for 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 months. We do have dollars to do rapid rehousing of folks, but there's going to be, there could be as much as a 20 to 25% increase in homelessness in our urban areas as those eviction moratoriums expire. And in fact, even with the moratoriums, there was still a fair number of evictions in our community, probably as many as we usually see. So we did see a little bit of an uptick in unsheltered street homeless. You can always tell someone that's been evicted, they've got a huge amount of stuff that they're hauling around with them. Eventually that stuff goes away. But we don't know right now how big that's going to be. My philosophy around planning is expect the worst and be surprised by it not being as bad as it is. So I think it's important that we have this discussion with amongst ourselves and certainly with our elected officials. What does our homeless response system here in Fort Worth look like if over the next 12 to 14 months, we do see a 20% increase in homelessness? So right now, well, on any one day, there may be anywhere from 22 to 2,600 people in our community. Over the course of a year, we'll see over 8,000 homeless folks. So, a 20% increase of 8,000 is another 1,600 people that are homeless. So right now we have about 1,200 people on the streets that are homeless. We probably have the capacity in our shelters and everything to shelter one night another 1,200. So to add 1,600 to that is going to be basically 1,600 more people on the streets. So we want to be sure that our capacity and our capability of being able to quickly and rapidly house people is sound and well funded. So what was the rest of that question, Liesl? I think I answered the biggest one. And what
I just, the other part was about the coming state mandates against the camping.
Oh, right. So, we talked about the negative social impact that unsheltered street homeless has on all of us. It creates fear, a loss of sense, it impacts our sense of security. And a lot of that has resulted in municipalities and states passing laws that further outlaw homelessness, laws that outlaw people, being able to sleep on the streets if they can't find anywhere else to sleep, or to sleep, out, in the bushes. So in the past, we kind of move people around. Sometimes people do get arrested if they're belligerent or if they're trespassing and a property owner has filed charges. But the state just passed I think it was passed in its final form, I'll have to check, a bill that will outlaw camping in Texas. And this would supersede any local laws. So think about that for a moment. So we know that when someone goes to jail, that costs $70 a day to take care of them, not counting the cost of having a police person come out, interact with them, the whole process of arresting them, the court process of adjudicating that crime. That's what our state's solution is around homelessness, and it's concerning to me. One, because people that are on the streets are not there by choice. It's because we as a community don't have any other options for them. So where are they supposed to go? Where are people supposed to sleep? If the shelters may be full, and we've got anywhere from 12 to, in the future, maybe 2,000 home people that are unsheltered every night, where do they go? We can't police our way out of that. We can't just merely criminalize homelessness and expect that to be a response. So if I'm homeless and I'm sleeping under a bridge and I refuse to leave because I don't have any place else to go, I can be arrested. And I will go to jail, and that will cost you and I $70 a day, not counting the cost of the patrol response, and not counting the cost of processing, the court process of that. I'll go to jail, and then I'll be fined. So I might be fined, $100. I'm homeless. I'm not working. I don't have any money. How am I going to pay that fine? So subsequently, what happens is on my record shows that I owe $100, and that fine might double, it might triple, and the next thing you know, I'm hopelessly in debt to the city in a way I'll never be able to pay. But as I leave homelessness and now want to have a clean record to go rent a house or rent an apartment or get a job. I've got this on my record, and it's a criminal record. And it's a real barrier to me recovering from homelessness. Uh, you can see it's a vicious circle. It's not an effective solution for the individual person, nor is it a cost-effective solution for us in the community. Now, I can understand people being afraid and fearful, and people's revulsion and the business community's alarm when you look at tents all over the place, where you look at people sleeping on the streets, you look at people panhandling everywhere. I mean, we're seeing that in Austin in particular. And I think the reason that the bill was passed is because all the state legislators see it in Austin. But is it really a solution, or is it merely a knee-jerk response to do something and do something quickly? So from my perspective, what it does is it sweeps the issue under the rug, or it kicks the can down the road, but it's not a long-term solution. It's a revolving door, and it's a very expensive one that you and I are paying for. We'll keep you all posted on the status of that. The legislative session ends next week. Doesn't it end on the 5th? Is that correct? Maybe it's the end of this week. We'll post on our website. I'm going to ask Liesl to do that. Any current laws that actually do get signed by the governor, doesn't become law unless it's signed by the governor. We'll keep everybody posted on that because these policies are in response to the impact that homelessness has on our community, not necessarily a response to the needs of the folks that are homeless. Any thoughts, any questions? Let's see.
Does anybody have any other questions? Okay, if not, I think we could probably wrap it up today. Bruce, do you want to have any closing remarks for us?
I do. The issues that we're talking about are not easy issues to talk about. They're complicated. There's the issue of how do people become homeless? How can we stop the spigot that leads to homelessness? How can we correct those conditions? How can we address some of the institutionalized biases in our community that reduce access to those things that are most likely to ensure we don't become homeless to certain folks in our community? I talk about things like institutionalized racism. It's well documented that people of color in our marginalized communities have much poorer health and educational outcomes and opportunities, and are in a very big way inappropriately represented in the homeless community. These are provocative questions. What have we set up in our history that leads to homelessness? How can we address issues that oftentimes evoke strong emotional responses in citizens? We are trying to address these issues in a very polarized environment as well. How do we make this a non-political issue and one that's more financial? What's the best solution that's going to create the highest quality of life for everybody? And we do have some solutions in place, and most of those are around affordable housing solutions for everybody, regardless of your ability to pay, and the need to build additional housing units, because traditionally Fort Worth has been primarily a single family urban area, and to house lots of people, we're going to need to build more multifamily units. So these are not easy issues. These are all tinderbox issues in our community, not just our community, but communities all over America. So I really want to thank you all for participating and for your interest in this, and how you all are becoming citizen warriors, really, around some of these issues. So Liesl and I are available at any time. Just call or text us or email us. We're more than happy to continue discussion with you. And we're both available to speak to any civic groups, any religious groups, any neighborhood groups about these issues, because we really want to enlist you all in this dialogue. And thank you all very much. I very much appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you, Bruce. And thank you, everybody. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye. Y'all have a good weekend.